Introduction. A New Reformation. I'm an atheist. I don't believe there is a God, she affirms. But then I began to feel this love, just overwhelming, all-encompassing love. There's a long silence. And the way I describe it is being bathed in God's love, she goes on, her voice cracking. Because I find no other way to describe it. I felt that I belonged, that I was part of everything and had the right to be here. How else do I describe it? Maybe what your mother's love felt like when you were a baby. This feeling of love was suffusing the entire experience. I'm talking with Dinah Baser, New Yorker, grandmother, survivor, and unrepentant non-believer. She was diagnosed with mixed-cell ovarian cancer in 2010 at the age of 63. Ordinarily, more than half the women in Dinah's position don't outlive the dreaded 5-year window past their diagnosis. But Dinah was one of the lucky ones. She caught her tumor early at stage 1C, ensuring much better odds of winning the battle. After 6 rounds of chemotherapy and 2 years of follow-up appointments, the cancer was in remission, and Dinah should have been feeling optimistic. But she couldn't shake her paralyzing fear of the disease that is never cured, only contained, and could always return with a vengeance. In 2012, Dinah confessed her existential crisis to one of the nurses from the Perlmutter Cancer Center at New York University during a routine checkup. It was suggested she enroll in a first-of-its-kind study that their psychiatric team was conducting with Johns Hopkins University. On its face, the researchers were trying to determine if psilocybin, the active compound in magic mushrooms, could ease depression and anxiety in cancer patients. According to the findings of the randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trial released in the respected Journal of Psychopharmacology in November 2016, the vast majority found clinical relief, with 87% of NYU's 29 volunteers reporting increased life satisfaction or well-being for months afterward. Like Dinah, a full 70% rated their one and only dose of psilocybin as either the most meaningful experience of their entire lives or among the top 5. The numbers were consistent with the 51 volunteers from the Hopkins study, the results of which were published simultaneously. Altogether, 80 tormented people dove into the unknown. Most left with a new lease on life, forever changed. The outcome is characterized as unprecedented within the field of psychiatry. While the new batch of data was eye-catching from a therapeutic perspective, the researchers weren't necessarily looking for the next Prozac or Xanax. There's not much money in a single-dose wonder drug. The pharmaceutical industry tends to prefer long-term users who get hooked on a steady regimen of renewable prescriptions. Instead, the NYU team had joined their colleagues at Hopkins on the hunt for something far more valuable. The real question wasn't whether psychedelics might work for those confronting death, but why? And the initial answers had already led the scientists down a rather unscientific path, trespassing into corridors of the mind that once interested students of religion alone. A decade earlier, in 2006, the Hopkins team completed the first psilocybin project since the 1970s, when research into the forbidden substance became largely impossible during the war on drugs. Under tightly controlled conditions, the psilocybin unleashed a profound, mystical experience that seemed to anchor the lasting emotional and psychological benefits recorded by the 36 volunteers. They had no life-threatening illness and were otherwise free of the debilitating angst that just consumed Dinah. But these early results were shockingly similar to the 2016 collaboration with NYU. 1/3 of the participants rated their experience as the most spiritually significant of their lives, comparing it to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. 2/3 placed it among the top 5. When friends, family, and co-workers were interviewed, they confirmed the remarkable transformations in the volunteers' mood and behavior for months, even years, following their single dose. From that moment on, Dr. Roland Griffiths upended his career to focus almost exclusively on psilocybin, creating what is now called the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Unit. More than 360 volunteers and 50 peer-reviewed publications later, he's ready to call a spade a spade. In his 2016 TED Talk, Griffith said the drug-induced ecstasy he routinely witnesses in the laboratory is virtually identical to that reported by natural-born prophets and visionaries throughout human history. The underlying experience itself, whether activated by psilocybin or some spontaneous internal flood of neurotransmitters, must be biologically normal. If we are essentially wired for mystical experience, it raises the intriguing prospect that, under the right mindset and environment, any curious soul can be instantly converted into a religious savant. Griffith's colleague, Dr. William Richards, has been testing that hypothesis since the 1960s, when he co-developed the very scale to measure these peak states of consciousness, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire. Richards himself holds the dubious distinction of administering the final dose of psilocybin in 1977 at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, the last legal refuge for this research before an extended hiatus. Together with Griffiths, he was the first to get the ball rolling again in the early 2000s, once the federal government was persuaded by the high standards of scholarly competence at Hopkins, one of the top medical schools in the country. In his 2015 book, Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, Richards maps out the essential features of the perfect psilocybin journey, transcending time and space, intuitively sensing the unity and sacredness of all things, accessing knowledge that is normally not available. Oftentimes, there is a merging of the everyday personality with a larger, more fundamental whole. Words fail to capture the unsinkable conviction that the experiencer has somehow glimpsed the ultimate nature of reality, an insight that seems blatantly obvious at the time, and is usually accompanied by intense feelings of joy, tranquility, exultation, and awe. On the ineffability scale, Dinah is certainly no exception. I'm wondering why an avowed atheist would appeal to God to describe the infinite love that bathed her as the psilocybin supercharged her biochemistry. Why not the love of the universe, or the love of the cosmos, or the love of nature, I ask. Because God is as good as the universe, and the cosmos, and nature. These are all things we really don't know. I've always thought heaven and hell were absurd ideas. I am not interested in mysticism at all. I tend to think of it as a bunch of baloney. And I don't think there's any meaning to life. But it doesn't matter to me, because my own experience is all I have. I've had very religious people ask me, "You don't believe in God?" And I say, "No, I believe in love." And I can still feel it sometimes. Even now, 7 years later? Oh yes. But words don't always fail. Dinah can dredge up poignant specifics about the visions, now indelibly tattooed on her psyche, that unfolded during the psilocybin session in 2012. Lying comfortably on a couch, with her eyes under a sleep shade, and headphones pumping a soothing mix of classical and instrumental music, she tackled the therapeutic portion of her 6-hour journey in pretty short order. In her mind's eye, Dinah saw what she immediately recognized as her fear and anxiety, a big, black lump like coal under my ribcage, on the left-hand side, which was not where the cancer was. It was not my cancer. Enraged, she yelled some colorful language at the inky intruder like a proper New Yorker, and in an instant it was gone. For good. The nasty part out of the way, Dinah had nothing left to do but enjoy the playlist that had been skillfully cobbled together by the NYU team. So I just drifted away. I was living in the music like a river. That's when the love of God entered Dinah's life. Staying with her for the remaining hours on the couch, and the many years since. But something else happened too, and the researchers believe it holds the key to the whole experience. The sequence is tricky to verbalize. Dinah is keen that I not misquote her by writing something as sentimental and cliched as being at one with the universe. So she describes a process in which there was a dissolution of the self and a melting away of barriers. She remembers the moment when concepts like internal and external no longer held true. I'm not just standing there looking out at the world anymore. I'm part of the world. After a lengthy pause, while she harvests the right phrase, Dinah refers to this fleeting moment as a state of pure being. She recalls taking several deep breaths, exhaling with force, just to hear the air escape her chest. She needed to prove that her physical body was still there, that it still existed somewhere in time and space. The source of her awareness, once so easy to locate, was suddenly everywhere and nowhere at once, and then it all made sense. In that unsettling, parallel reality, waiting effortlessly to the violins, Dinah arrived at the realization that birth and death actually don't have any meaning. When forced to clarify, she adds, "It's more of a state of always being." Always being? Always being. So being now and always. There's no beginning or end. Every moment is an eternity of its own. A poetic breakthrough from a skeptic. That's precisely what Dinah's guide, Dr. Anthony Bossis, was hoping for. As a professor with NYU's Department of Psychiatry and its director of palliative care research for the psilocybin study, the clinical psychologist's professional specialty is the existential, spiritual, and psychological distress that preys on so many Americans as they approach death. Recent statistics show that depression is up 26% for those at the end of life. In a culture that generally avoids the topic, subcontracting the gritty details over to a ballooning hospice care industry, Bossis believes we simply don't end well in this country. Instead of a bad death marked by needless suffering, he sees psilocybin as a meaning-making medicine with enormous potential, not just for the dying, but for everybody. The historic partnership with Hopkins gave Bossis a front-row seat to the cutting-edge research of Roland Griffiths and William Richards that had fascinated him for years. His unforgettable sessions with Dinah and dozens of other volunteers brought home the real-world consequences of the seemingly unreal experience at the mystical core of these psilocybin trials. For Bossis, Dinah is the ultimate example of the sustained positive impact that can be triggered by an unexpected rendezvous with God's love, even for an atheist. While language can never do justice to what Dinah experienced, she undoubtedly made contact with what Bossis calls a timeless dimension that fosters non-attachment to all the pain, despair, and stress of being human, allowing a connection to something more enduring within. In a personal email, Bossis explained why such an irrational event can reliably generate so much meaning for those on the verge of death. Participants in our study often describe this experience with the newfound knowledge that consciousness survives bodily death, that we are not only our bodies, which is a profound gift to a person with a body that is failing and will soon stop functioning due to advanced disease. It has been described as a transcendence of past, present, future, timelessness in the moment. I've heard participants speak about feeling outside of time. The insight that we are not bound by the material world is a powerful one. It is psychologically, existentially, and spiritually liberating. In order to identify with that grander, more expansive aspect of themselves, the part that might never die, in Dinah's state of always being, a shedding of the familiar has to occur. Surrendering the physical body and losing all sense of time and space can feel disorienting, like a little death all in itself. As if a foreshadow of what's to come, Bossis writes, some of the volunteers say, "This is what death will be like. This is death." William Richards has been documenting the same phenomenon since the 1960s, using the identical words as Dinah to describe the transition into mystical realms of consciousness as melting or dissolving, even as being deliciously seduced by a divine lover. In Sacred Knowledge, Psychedelics and Religious Experiences, he further adds, "The mind may undergo one or more intense experiences of death and rebirth, and awareness of the ego, that is, that part of your mind that functions with your name in everyday life, may ebb and flow. Similarly, awareness of the body lying on the couch may come and go as one might expect to experience in a state of deep trance. This threshold between the personal, that is, the everyday self, and the transpersonal, that is, more fundamental or universal dimensions of consciousness, is conceptualized by different people in different ways. Most commonly, the term death is employed as the ego, everyday self, feels that it is quite literally dying. Though one may have read that others have reported subsequent immersion in the eternal and experiences of being reborn and returning to everyday existence afterward, in the moment, imminence of death may feel acutely, and for some terrifyingly, real. And right there, plain as can be, is the stated goal of every mystic or saint who has ever tried to put any of the world's religions to the ultimate test: to die before you die. Or rather, to psychologically maim the ego, even for a brief instant, in order to be initiated into an understanding of what lies beneath all the thoughts, feelings, and memories that have gone into the lifetime construction of our false, or at the very least incomplete, sense of self. The little ego, Latin for I, that seems so firmly in control is just an elaborate illusion, and only half the story, as brilliantly narrated by the Harvard-trained neuroanatomist Jill Bolte Taylor in her 2008 book, My Stroke of Insight. With minute attention to every detail, Bolte Taylor recounts the cerebral hemorrhage she suffered in 1996, when the rupture of a blood vessel in a very strategic area of her left hemisphere sent all calculating intelligence out the window. The half of her brain responsible for categorizing and organizing sensory input simply went offline. Suddenly, there was no more brain chatter, no dialogue with her inner voice, that advisor that helps us navigate the external world by comparing incoming data from the five senses to past experiences and running split-second algorithms to determine the best course of future action. It's the kind of linear, rational thinking that reminds us to restock the refrigerator or put gas in the car before it's too late. It prompts us into the bathroom when nature calls, leaving infants and toddlers to soil their diapers. Before the ego has fully formed, this mental back and forth takes a few years to mature and lock in place. But once it does, the left hemisphere assumes daily command, forcing the right hemisphere's more immediate awareness of the present moment into the shadows of forgotten childhood. During Bolte Taylor's stroke, it wasn't about what happened before or what comes next, but what's happening now. The same timeless now that awed Dinah with its endlessness. Every moment is an eternity of its own. Could this be how newborns see the world, before they even realize they're separate beings, independent of their mothers? Every parent gets a kick out of that developmental milestone when babies finally realize they have arms, staring in disbelief at the hands attached to their alien limbs. "Whoa, I'm a weird-looking thing," Bolte Taylor recalls reacting to her body during the initial stages of the stroke, while she mounted the cardio glide for her morning exercise routine. Like a great whale gliding through a sea of silent euphoria, the scientist felt no worry, no concern, and no grief whatsoever, and with total contentment, she prepared to die. But like Dinah and the hundreds of psilocybin volunteers ushered through a harrowing ego death in recent years, Bolte Taylor survived, reborn with fresh eyes and childlike wonder into the half of her brain that went missing with the pacifier. She calls it the deep inner peace circuitry of the right hemisphere. Once it was reactivated, she could find solace in that sea of silent euphoria throughout the 8 years it took to fully recover from the stroke. Similarly, Dinah tells me she can relive the sensation of being bathed in God's love if she's just able to slow down. She doesn't meditate as often as she'd like, but whenever she does, that divine love wells up. The NYU playlist can trigger it too. Bosses gave her a copy after the psilocybin session, which Dinah particularly enjoys listening to on Thanksgiving. Whatever kind of God this is, it has nothing to do with tired doctrine or stale dogma. It's a felt presence that never judges, never condemns, never demands anything in return. Certainly not blind belief. When I visited William Richards at his oasis of a home outside Baltimore in the early summer of 2018, he distilled his decades' worth of research like a Zen master. Once you've plunged into the ocean, does it really matter whether or not you believe in water? Dinah might not have been looking for it, but what she got was a genuine religious experience. And it's the kind of experience that just might speak to the rising tide of seekers who could spend a lifetime in the church, temple, or mosque and never once feel the rapture that is consistently delivered in a single afternoon at Hopkins and NYU. Over 1 billion people across the planet are now religiously unaffiliated, including 1 in 5 Americans and Europeans and almost half the British public. The unchurching of America is being driven especially by the 40% of millennials who don't identify with any faith whatsoever. That figure is more than double what it was a generation ago. The God now rejected by America's largest generation, 73 million people, is not the God of Dinah Baser. A God that you can actually experience in a direct and personal way is a God that makes sense. A God that erases depression and anxiety like a cosmic surgeon, obliterates the fear of death, and sends a shockwave of love through your fragile heart is a God that lives in high definition, and a God that could hardly be expected to start a war against non-believers. More troubling is the God of organized religion and his army of spokesmen, those priests, rabbis, and imams who stand between superficial definitions of heaven and a common-sense public who have every right to demand proof. When the answer to their doubts is condescending moralism contrived from an outdated and impenetrable holy book, it's time to cut out the middleman in the private search for transcendence. The result is the 27% of all Americans fueling the spiritual but not religious, SBNR, phenomenon. It has been called the most important religious development of our time because the trend is clear and will only surge in the years to come. With unprecedented access to the teachings of the world's faiths, we are living in an age when the rallying cry of the SBNRs has never been more achievable: to be the student and beneficiary of all traditions and the slave to none. If there's a spiritual crisis in the West, it's because the defenders of the 3 great monotheistic faiths have forgotten their roots. When Yahweh appeared to Moses in a burning bush, it was a terrifying ordeal. The emancipator of the Israelites feared for his life and shielded his eyes from the God who would later warn in Exodus 33:20, "You cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live." Christianity's greatest missionary, St. Paul, was struck blind for 3 days on the road to Damascus by a flash of heaven-sent light, followed by an auditory hallucination of Jesus. Thereafter, Paul would claim continued supernatural communication with the Son of God. The entire Quran was dictated to Muhammad, word for word, by the angel Gabriel, who revealed Islam's scripture in a series of trances. One of Muhammad's earliest biographers, Ibn Ishaq, records the belief of family friends that the young prophet suffered a stroke. Modern scholars say he was prone to ecstatic seizures. "There is no other way to start a religion," says the Benedictine monk Brother David Steindl-Rast. "Every religion has its mystical core. The challenge is to find access to it and to live in its power." In what he calls the centuries-long tension between the mystical and the religious establishment, the technicians who yearn for real experience are always butting heads with the authorities who are just trying to keep the house in working order. According to Brother David, time has an influence on the system. The pipes tend to get rusty and start to leak, or they get clogged up. the flow from the source slows down to a trickle. When that happens, the experience of dying as God recedes into the mists of history. The written word that tries to capture the original encounter inevitably replaces the personal experience of awe, so that live doctrine fossilizes into dogmatism, and the ethics and morality that attempt to translate mystical communion into practical living are reduced to moralism. But despite the dogmatism and moralism that inevitably muck up the system, the mystics have always come along with an embarrassing reminder for the self-appointed enforcers of the establishment's rules and regulations. When it comes to God, a word rarely used by the mystics, there is total unanimity on one crucial issue of paramount importance. God does not reside in a holy book. Whether it's the Bible or the Quran, the mystics have never found God by reading about God. There is no class, no lecture, no homily that will ever bring you closer to God, because there is, in fact, absolutely nothing you could ever learn about God. For the mystics, the only way to know God is to experience God, and the only way to experience God is to unlearn everything the ego has been trying so vigorously to manufacture since our infancy. In order to stop wetting the bed and become productive members of society, that deep inner peace circuitry of the right hemisphere has been sidelined along the way. To bring it back online, say the mystics, the simplest and most effective method is to die before you die. It's why the Sufis, the mystics of Islam, have been called the impatient ones. Rather than wait until their actual death, the spiritual experts of the world's second largest religion rank one task more urgent than any other: recovering an awareness of one's full identity in this lifetime. The 12th century Persian pharmacist Attar once said, "So long as we do not die to ourselves, and so long as we are identified with someone or something, we shall never be free." His protege, Rumi, the Sufi master and, in recent years, best-selling poet in America, was in total agreement. If you could get rid of yourself just once, the secret of secrets would open to you. The face of the unknown, hidden beyond the universe, would appear on the mirror of your perception. It's why a fundamental concept for the Kabbalists, the mystics of Judaism, is ayin, nothingness. When a man attains to the stage of self-annihilation, he can thus be said to have reached the world of the divine nothingness. Emptied of selfhood, his soul has now become attached to the true reality. Rabbi Lawrence Kushner has written extensively about the process that he calls a rehearsal for our moment of transition. Just as the death of each creature is in turn a rehearsal for the death of a species, and a galaxy, and a cosmos. The great rhythm of going out and returning. Now, this kind of death is not an end, but only the beginning of a transformation that will generate a rebirth. You cannot be reborn until you are willing to die. It's why the German theologian Meister Eckhart, the mystic par excellence of medieval Christianity, puts so much emphasis on the self-effacement that is the one condition precedent to finding God. If you could not yourself for an instant, indeed I say less than an instant, you would possess all. Eckhart describes the nullification of the ego as a process of unlearning, in which the soul must lose her being and her life in something like Balti Taylor's Sea of Silent Euphoria. We cannot serve this word better than in stillness and silence. There we can hear it, and there too we will understand it aright, in the unknowing. To him who knows nothing, it appears and reveals itself. To this day, all visitors to St. Paul's Monastery on Mount Athos in Greece, one of the most important sites in Orthodox spirituality, will come face to face with a beautiful Greek saying mounted on the wall of the reception area. If you die before you die, you won't die when you die. Notice the complete absence of the word God in the preceding quotations. Something tells me that if the mystics were in charge of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the world would be a very different place. where even a pragmatist like Dinah might find herself agreeing with the old adage about mysticism. Atheists and mystics both essentially believe in nothing. The only difference is that mystics spell it with a capital N. And if enough consenting, healthy adults could experience what Dinah experienced with proper preparation and guidance, even once in their lives, we just might have a new reformation on our hands. That's what British philosopher Aldous Huxley predicted back in the 1950s, in the wake of his sublime experience with mescaline, peyote's visionary compound. In The Doors of Perception from 1954, Huxley recorded his own taste of egolessness, resulting in the epiphany that all is in all, that all is actually each. His mescaline-occasioned mystical experience was described as the closest a finite mind can ever come to perceiving everything that is happening everywhere in the universe. Decades ahead of the unchurching of America and most of Europe, Huxley spotted an antidote to the 90 minutes of boredom that was already plaguing the average Sunday churchgoer. In a later opinion published in the Saturday Evening Post in 1958, he foresaw a future where psychedelics might turn organized religion into a thing of the past. My own belief is that, though they may start by being something of an embarrassment, these new mind changers will tend in the long run to deepen the spiritual life of the communities in which they are available. That famous revival of religion, about which so many people have been talking for so long, will not come about as the result of evangelistic mass meetings, or the television appearances of photogenic clergymen. It will come about as the result of biochemical discoveries that will make it possible for large numbers of men and women to achieve a radical self-transcendence and a deeper understanding of the nature of things. And this revival of religion will be at the same time a revolution. From being an activity mainly concerned with symbols, religion will be transformed into an activity concerned mainly with experience and intuition, and everyday mysticism, underlying and giving significance to everyday rationality, everyday tasks and duties, everyday human relationships. 60 years later, however, the religious establishment still generally shares the opinion of the federal government that mescaline, psilocybin, and their psychedelic sisters should remain entirely off limits. Throughout history, the mystics have been persecuted and sometimes executed for a reason. Nothing could be more alarming to the ecclesiastical hierarchy, the philosopher Alan Watts once observed, than a popular outbreak of mysticism, for this might well amount to setting up a democracy in the kingdom of heaven. In the United States, these compounds are still classified as Schedule I drugs under the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which means they have no currently accepted medical use and demonstrate a high potential for abuse. This, despite the fact that the elimination of Dinah's anxiety in 2012 approaches something of a medical miracle, and that she hasn't touched psilocybin since. Regardless of the federal government's position, the steady march of science is winning converts at the local level, where the earliest buds of the psychedelic reformation are beginning to flower. In May 2019, Denver became the very first city in the country to decriminalize the use and possession of magic mushrooms. Oakland and Santa Cruz soon followed in California, with their city councils extending the treatment to all naturally occurring psychedelic plants and fungi. As the first to legalize statewide cannabis for personal use in 2012, Colorado is already home to the International Church of Cannabis, which opened its doors in 2017. The first psychedelic churches will inevitably be next. Is this an artificial get-God-quick scheme? Or, as Huxley predicted, are we witnessing the birth of a genuine reformation, with the practical mystics of the 21st century leading the charge? For this movement to have any substance or merit, Huxley's vision must be based on rock-solid historical precedent. After all, the Reformation of the 16th century had some serious scholarship behind it. Martin Luther's fascination with the original Greek language of the New Testament was a product of the humanism that had engulfed Renaissance Europe. The humanist chief motto was ad fontes, back to the source in Latin, which meant a return to the intellectual brilliance of the Greek and Roman ancestors, the midwives of the Christian faith. Luther based his German translation of the Bible on the Greek edition published in 1516 by the Dutch humanist Erasmus, who had meticulously compared the original New Testament with as many Latin manuscripts as he could find in order to root out any discrepancies with the Greek source material. It has been said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched. The rediscovery of Christianity's true origins and its real meaning being the primary motivation of the entire Reformation. When Huxley wrote of a revival of religion in 1958, that's precisely what he had in mind as well. Except he wasn't looking to the New Testament. He was looking beyond the book, back to the original practices of the Paleo-Christians that surrounded the New Testament. In the doors of perception, he entered sacrilegious waters. In the early centuries of Christianity, many pagan rites and festivals were baptized, so to say, and made to serve the purposes of the church. Without getting into the specifics of a contentious debate, Huxley characterized the pre-Christian ceremonies as soul-satisfying expressions of fundamental urges that were incorporated into the fabric of the new religion. Strangely, he didn't further pursue the so-called pagan continuity hypothesis, the theory that Christianity didn't magically appear from one day to the next, but inherited pagan elements from the Greco-Roman cults of the ancient Mediterranean world. It wasn't a new theory by any means. The debate between secular and ecclesiastical scholars over the Church's origins stretches back to the 19th century. In 1950, another Martin Luther, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., would weigh in with an essay titled The Influence of the Mystery Religions on Christianity. There was a time when people could discuss such things and respectfully disagree with civility. In 1954, the only thing Huxley added was a psychedelic twist. By calling the foundations of Christianity into question, Huxley was prophesying not only the death of organized religion, but a return to its mystical roots, and a revival of something that, if the pieces could just be fit together, would not only rewrite the origins of Christianity, but Western civilization at large. The task was too daunting for the British philosopher, however, and better left to the classicists, the specialists in Greek and Latin like Erasmus and Martin Luther, who would carry the torch in the years to come. Only they had the ad fontes training to decipher what Houston Smith, author of The World's Religions and perhaps the preeminent religious scholar of the 20th century, would later refer to as the best-kept secret in history. To this day, it remains the greatest unsolved mystery of the ancient past. Centuries of scholars working round the clock on the avid hunt for answers. What was the original sacrament of Western civilization? And did it somehow sneak its way into the primitive rites of Christianity? If the experts ever turn up new information on the real reason why the universe of Greek-speaking pagans became the founding generations of Christianity, turning a Jewish healer from Galilee into the most famous human being who ever lived, it promises the Reformation to end all reformations. Because the mystical core, the ecstatic source, and the true lifeblood of the biggest religion the world has ever known will have finally been exposed. Like this book, the pagan continuity hypothesis with a psychedelic twist is divided into two very simple questions. 1. Before the rise of Christianity, did the ancient Greeks consume a secret psychedelic sacrament during their most famous and well-attended religious rituals? 2. Did the ancient Greeks pass a version of their sacrament along to the earliest Greek-speaking Christians, for whom the original Holy Communion or Eucharist was in fact a psychedelic Eucharist? If the answer to the first question is yes, and the roots of Western civilization were soaked in mind-altering drugs, then the recent experiments at Hopkins and NYU would appear to be anything but a modern fad. Indeed, it would force a massive reassessment of our current relationship with naturally occurring substances that were not only sacred, but indispensable to the architects of democracy and the world as we know it. If the answer to both questions is yes, then the new Reformation is as well-grounded and historically oriented as Martin Luther's Reformation, and it becomes an immediate reality for tens of millions of SBNRs and religiously disillusioned. But more pressingly, today's 2.42 billion Christians, almost 1/3 of the global population, will have to decide whether they will continue sipping from a placebo amid 90 minutes of boredom, or join the revolution that just might rescue a dying faith and a civilization on the edge of extinction. 2,000 years in the making, the crisis is real, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Unfortunately, the war for the soul of Western civilization has been neatly tucked away in dry academic journals and arcane conferences where none of the learned infighting filters down to the general public. A little translation would go a long way, but just when they're needed most, all the interpreters seem to be disappearing, keeping all the controversy behind closed doors, and until now, leaving this book unwritten. The classics are dying, and dying fast. Or maybe they're already dead. Who better than two very disgruntled, Stanford-educated professors to assess the situation? A mock epic struggle of nocturnal creatures croaking and scratching at each other for their tiny lily pad on an evaporating pond. Such was the judgment rendered in 2001 in Who Killed Homer? The Demise of Classical Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom. In their bitter indictment of academia, Victor David Hansen and John Robert Heath eulogized the imminent death of our Greek intellectual heritage. They lay the blame squarely on spineless administrators and egg-headed inbred classics departments. On the one hand, there's the fear of leaving today's students unequipped with the kind of practical skills needed in a 21st century economy. What college or university can honestly afford to push majors in dead languages? Working round the clock on the avid hunt for answers. What was the original sacrament of Western civilization? And did it somehow sneak its way into the primitive rites of Christianity? If the experts ever turn up new information on the real reason why the universe of Greek-speaking pagans became the founding generations of Christianity, turning a Jewish healer from Galilee into the most famous human being who ever lived, it promises the Reformation to end all reformations. Because the mystical core, the ecstatic source, and the true lifeblood of the biggest religion the world has ever known will have finally been exposed. Like this book, the pagan continuity hypothesis with a psychedelic twist is divided into two very simple questions. 1. Before the rise of Christianity, did the ancient Greeks consume a secret psychedelic sacrament during their most famous and well-attended religious rituals? 2. Did the ancient Greeks pass a version of their sacrament along to the earliest Greek-speaking Christians, for whom the original Holy Communion or Eucharist was in fact a psychedelic Eucharist? If the answer to the first question is yes, and the roots of Western civilization were soaked in mind-altering drugs, then the recent experiments at Hopkins and NYU would appear to be anything but a modern fad. Indeed, it would force a massive reassessment of our current relationship with naturally occurring substances that were not only sacred, but indispensable to the architects of democracy and the world as we know it. If the answer to both questions is yes, then the new Reformation is as well-grounded and historically oriented as Martin Luther's Reformation, and it becomes an immediate reality for tens of millions of SBNRs and religiously disillusioned. But more pressingly, today's 2.42 billion Christians, almost 1/3 of the global population, will have to decide whether they will continue sipping from a placebo amid 90 minutes of boredom, or join the revolution that just might rescue a dying faith and a civilization on the edge of extinction. 2,000 years in the making, the crisis is real, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Unfortunately, the war for the soul of Western civilization has been neatly tucked away in dry academic journals and arcane conferences where none of the learned infighting filters down to the general public. A little translation would go a long way, but just when they're needed most, all the interpreters seem to be disappearing, keeping all the controversy behind closed doors, and until now, leaving this book unwritten. The classics are dying, and dying fast. Or maybe they're already dead. Who better than two very disgruntled, Stanford-educated professors to assess the situation? A mock epic struggle of nocturnal creatures croaking and scratching at each other for their tiny lily pad on an evaporating pond. Such was the judgment rendered in 2001 in Who Killed Homer? The Demise of Classical Education and the Recovery of Greek Wisdom. In their bitter indictment of academia, Victor David Hansen and John Robert Heath eulogized the imminent death of our Greek intellectual heritage. They lay the blame squarely on spineless administrators and egg-headed inbred classics departments. On the one hand, there's the fear of leaving today's students unequipped with the kind of practical skills needed in a 21st century economy. What college or university can honestly afford to push majors in dead languages? Once the school gets a reputation for graduating unemployed deadbeats, the jig is up. On the other hand, there are the classicists themselves. That vast gulf between the vitality of the Greeks and the timidity of those who are responsible for preserving the Greeks, between the clarity and exuberance of the former and the obscurity and dullness of the latter. A brutal combination. Between the bureaucrats and the bookworms, our institutions of higher learning have been sucked dry of the very thing that created them in the first place, Latin and Greek. For most of Western history, studying these ancient languages was the only thing you could do at a university. Since the Renaissance, higher education has largely been synonymous with fluency in the classics. Just think of the cult of antiquity, fostered by the first generations of Americans. John Adams' opinion that Athens and Rome had done more honor to our species, humanity, than all the rest, was far from unique in the late 18th century. The principal drafter of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, looked to classical literature as the ultimate source of both delight and instruction. Historian Carl Richard explains that the grammar in grammar school actually refers to Greek and Latin grammar. The prevailing opinion of the time was that the classroom should be reserved for serious academic subjects like classical languages, rather than wasted on things the child could easily learn at home, like English grammar. In the ensuing years, however, newer utilitarian subjects slipped into the curriculum for the very first time. The physical sciences, modern languages, history, and geography. Noah Webster, the father of American scholarship and education, and the guy behind the famous dictionary, wanted to get down to brass tacks. What advantage does a merchant, a mechanic, a farmer derive from an acquaintance with Greek and Roman tongues? After World War II, many universities dropped Greek from the core curriculum altogether, making it possible to graduate with zero knowledge of Western civilization's mother tongue. You can hear Hansen and Heath reminiscing about the glory days, bracing for the inevitable. As long as literacy, polished written and oral expression, familiarity with politics and social systems, and a common set of unchanging ethical presumptions were the chief goals of a liberal arts education, as long as education itself demanded some memorization and structure from the student, classics would not vanish, even if enrollments in the classical languages took their customarily cyclical decline. The study of classics had always been at the center of Western education, had always risen to the challenge, answering the charges of irrelevancy and practicality and pagan-inspired iniquity. The university itself, remember, was a Greek idea, its entire structure, nomenclature, and operation Greco-Roman to the core. 20th century minds as diverse as T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Picasso, and Winston Churchill proved the value of classics for knowledge, expression, and eloquence, for radicals and reactionaries alike. Then, according to the Stanford duo, came the self-righteous 1960s. The same countercultural movement that gave rise to anti-war protests, classic rock, and psychedelics also put enormous pressure on an antiquated model of education, one well beyond its expiration date. Dead languages just didn't fit the times, with personal growth and self-indulgence leading more students to the arts or social sciences like politics, economics, and psychology, and less to the ancient past. Authority and tradition were to be questioned at all costs. Nobody wanted to study useless grammar and syntax with a bunch of old, white World War I vets, If the Vatican itself was about to remove Latin from the Mass for God's sake, there was no hope for the American university. And that's how, after more than 2,500 years, Homer finally went the way of the typewriter. In recent years, enrollments in ancient Greek have plummeted. This is no customarily cyclical decline. As it turns out, Hansen and Heath were on point. They saw the writing on the wall and accurately predicted it back in 2001. The Greeks, unfamiliar to the general public at large, are also now dead in the university itself. Today, classics embraces a body of knowledge and a way of looking at the world that are virtually unrecognized, an almost extinct species even in its own precious habitat, the academic department. We classicists are the dodo birds of academia. When we retire or die, our positions are either eliminated or replaced with temporary and part-time help. I was one of the lucky ones, I guess. I got to see the rare species up close and personal, before it took a final, well-deserved bow. Founded in 1851, St. Joe's Prep was no place for a wise-ass from the blue-collar enclave of Northeast Philadelphia, whose only familiarity with such institutions came from watching Dead Poets Society and School Ties. I sometimes cursed the chance scholarship that ushered me into the fanciest all-boys high school in the city. But there were two things in the Jesuit playbook that quickly turned me into a bona fide member of the inner circle: Latin and Greek. It was love at first sight. 4 years later, absolutely convinced that I was destined to be a classics professor or a priest, I was recruited by Brown University to continue my useless study of the ancient world. As the first person in my family to attend college, I decided to blow the opportunity on dead languages, picking up Sanskrit along the way. For 4 more years, I traveled back in time, straight to the source, ad fontes, with nothing lost in translation, direct from the minds of the people who birthed Western civilization and penned the New Testament. My classes in the historic McFarland House on College Hill rarely saw more than 5 students, and yet it never once occurred to me that I was woefully unprepared for life in the real world. Not until I heard the graduate students grumbling about the job market and mourning the grim reality summed up by Hansen and Heath. So many PhDs in classics, so little employment. Because there are almost no students, because there is really no interest in the Greeks, in or out of the university. Chock full of useless knowledge and no marketable skills, I did the only other thing I was qualified for at that point. I joined the legal profession. After graduating law school and passing the New York bar, I tried to settle into my new life on Wall Street at Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy. Hoping I'd actually learn something about international corporate finance, the partners made me subscribe to The Economist. In the summer of 2007, I randomly plucked an issue from the growing pile of unread magazines in the corner of my office. The title of the article that would forever change my life smacked me in the face: The God Pill. It was a brief write-up of the very first psilocybin experiment at Hopkins. I'll never forget the moment when I read that statistic about 2/3 of volunteers counting their single dose of the drug among the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives. An ethnomycologist by the name of R. Gordon Wasson was mentioned in the first line of the article, the inspiration behind the opening salvo of the psychedelic renaissance that would culminate in the 50 peer-reviewed papers from the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Research Unit. I instantly remembered a book titled The Road to Elusive, first published in 1978. I'd read it at Brown, in addition to every other book in the John D. Rockefeller Jr. Library that had anything to do with ancient Greek religion. Together with co-authors Albert Hofmann and Carl Ruck, Wasson claimed a potent psychedelic was behind the life-changing vision universally witnessed over the millennia by initiates in Eleusis, the Greek spiritual capital, about 13 miles northwest of Athens. From Boston University, Ruck would later suggest that Christianity itself was similarly founded on drugs. It was certainly an unconventional line of thought. At the time, however, there was very little scholarship specifically dedicated to drug use in ancient Greece or early Christianity. With no way to dig deeper, that's where I had to leave the idea for many years, until William Richards and Roland Griffiths, the chief researchers at Hopkins, brought it back on my radar in the most unexpected way possible, through the laboratory. I logged straight on to my new Amazon account and used my law firm salary to order everything Wasson, Hoffman, or Ruck had ever written. I then spent the next 12 years researching this book, as a 30-year-old hypothesis became a 40-year-old hypothesis to which no one paid any attention. To this day, I have never personally experimented with psychedelics, in the conscious effort to let the objective evidence guide the investigation that has consumed my adult life. While the Hopkins and NYU data was compelling from a circumstantial perspective, hard evidence linking the ancient Greeks or Paleo-Christians to a psychedelic sacrament was pretty elusive. So I kept my nose to the grindstone on nights and weekends when I wasn't practicing law, as additional data started coming in from other scientific disciplines like archaeobotany and archaeochemistry, which have now proven the existence of hallucinogenic beer and wine in the ancient Mediterranean, and its possible consumption for ritual purposes. Finally, 60 years after Aldous Huxley first issued his manifesto for a new Reformation, the pagan continuity hypothesis with a psychedelic twist is being put to the 21st century test, and the public needs to know about it. The problem is, this material is pretty dense. Take it from a one-time aspiring classicist. Google won't help. The original sources that inform the pagan continuity hypothesis are so niche, so obscure, and so damn hard to find that the only way to separate fact from fiction is to roll up your sleeves and track them down the old-fashioned way, in libraries, museums, and archives. Many are tucked away overseas, where ancient and modern language barriers make this stuff inaccessible to a fault. And then there are the archaeological sites scattered around the Mediterranean, some of which are holding on to clues that can be deciphered only in person. Perhaps most important of all are the experts themselves who dedicate their lives to the many disciplines with a stake in this quest. They don't always commit everything they know to writing, so simply paying a visit and tapping their brains can often yield incredible results. Over the past year, I journeyed to Greece, Germany, Spain, France, and Italy to get to the bottom of history's best-kept secret once and for all. If a psychedelic sacrament is essential for the birth of Western civilization and Christianity, where's the proof? I sat down with the government ministers, curators, and archivists whose mission is to guard precious relics that rarely see the light of day. I grilled the excavators, archaeobotanists, and archaeochemists who are in the field and laboratory right now unearthing fresh evidence of our ancestors' ritualistic use of drugs and subjecting it to a battery of high-tech instrumentation. And I trekked through time with the classicists, historians, and biblical scholars who are trying to make sense of it all. This investigation has led me to conclusions I never could have anticipated 12 years ago. Not only is there evidence of psychedelic beer and wine at the heart of the Greek and Christian mysteries, but also evidence of their suppression by the religious authorities. I spent a significant amount of time at the Vatican, developing a working relationship with the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology. I inspected the Paleo-Christian catacombs controlled by the Pope under the streets of Rome. I descended into the Vatican necropolis under St. Peter's Basilica that is never discussed in Catholic school. I analyzed little-known artifacts with the curators of the Vatican museums, and I spent the better part of a year cultivating a genuine friendship with God's librarian at the Vatican Secret Archives, where I managed to root through manuscripts few have ever touched. The climax of my time in the Holy See was a behind-the-scenes appointment with the recently opened archives of the Inquisition, targeting key documents that have never before been translated into English. The result is a jarring confrontation with the pivotal role that women played in the preparation of the original Eucharist, and its survival among heretical Christian sects that the Vatican continues to battle to this day. The following pages track my full immersion into the mystery. I explore an ancient Greece that is in serious danger of vanishing from the university curriculum, and an early, secret form of Christianity that has been scrubbed from the record. I present every piece of evidence that, taken together, finally convinced me of the psychedelic reality behind Western civilization's original religion. A prehistoric ritual that survived for millennia in the total absence of the written word before finding a good home among the Greeks. A tradition that was later inherited by the first Greek-speaking Christians, especially in Italy, where they came under attack by the Church Fathers. A vast knowledge of drugs that was kept alive through the Dark Ages by pagans and heretics, until the witches of the world were hunted down for centuries, erasing all memory of the longest-running religion the planet has ever known. It doesn't have a name, and probably never had one. But one thing is certain, that storied tension between the mystics and the bureaucrats has reached a breaking point. In order to find our soul again, a popular outbreak of mysticism could be just what the doctor ordered. And the prescription could be exactly what it was in the beginning, to die before we die, with a solid dose of the religion that started it all, the religion with no name. Part 1. Brewing the Psychedelic Beer. Chapter 1. Identity Crisis. Though we are liable to forget, Western civilization was not founded as a Christian enterprise. The ancient Greece that invented democracy and birthed all the arts and sciences we now take for granted never heard of Jesus. Before Jerusalem, before Rome, before Mecca, there was Eleusis. If Athens of the 5th and 4th centuries BC was the true source of Western life in the 21st century, then Eleusis was our first undisputed spiritual capital. Throughout classical antiquity, the quaint harbor town was ground zero for generations of seekers, but its religion wouldn't last forever. In the battle for the sacred legacy of the West, Eleusis was a spectacular casualty. Its demise at the hands of the newly Christianized Roman Empire in the 4th century AD marked the beginning of an identity crisis that persists to this day. Are we Greek or are we Christian? Under the traditional view, our Greek ancestors may have built the world as we know it, but Christianity saved its soul. Like the children of divorced parents, we try not to choose favorites or take sides, and we largely ignore the fact that the Greeks managed to find salvation long before Christianity showed up. A perfectly reasonable oversight, with the former center of the Mediterranean universe now scattered in ruins. Today, the archaeological site of Eleusis is little more than crumbling bits of marble and limestone, and since 1882, the excavations have only turned up more questions than answers. Why did the pilgrims flock to its temple for 2,000 years in search of life beyond the grave? Why was the age-old ritual performed under the cover of darkness? Why was the magic potion hidden away? And why did the Christians shut it all down? If you're not careful, the oldest unsolved riddle in the history of Western civilization has a way of getting inside your bones. When so much of their genius has survived, it just doesn't make sense for the religion of the people who created Western culture to simply vanish into thin air. There has to be more to the mysteries of Eleusis, the longest-running and most prominent spiritual tradition in ancient Greece. Unfortunately, it was shrouded in secrecy from the very beginning, leaving nothing but hints and clues about what really took place within the holy precinct. Aristotle once said the initiates came to Eleusis not to learn something, but to experience something. Whatever that experience was, it has successfully eluded scholars for centuries. That's how this puzzle was designed, after all. Fragments of the strange rites and ceremonies can be reconstructed, but the main attraction remains unknown. Year after year, how were the mysteries able to consistently deliver on an impossible promise? If you come to Eleusis, you will never die. A bold claim, for sure. Hard to believe nowadays. But for some reason, our ancestors believed it. In fact, they couldn't imagine a world without the exceptional landmark. The mysteries were said to hold the entire human race together. Life itself would be unlivable in their absence. Among all the unanswered questions about Eleusis, one inescapable fact keeps researchers glued to the obscure corner of southern Greece that spoke to millions. It stood the test of time. Well before Jesus walked the shores of Galilee, Eleusis was a beacon of hope in a nasty age of uncertainty, when the average life expectancy was much lower than today. Half the population might not reach the age of 5. For those who survived a traumatic childhood and managed to avoid enslavement, natural disasters, food shortages, violence, social unrest, deadly plagues, and infectious disease made for a far nastier existence than our own, with as much as 60% of the Greco-Roman world succumbing to the bacteria and viruses we have now largely managed to control. If COVID-19 offers any insight on the past, it's the psychological and emotional toll of a pandemic and the sense of helplessness that must have been excruciating for our ancestors. But as long as the mysteries were celebrated once a year around the fall equinox, everything was in order. It was a foolproof formula that ran uninterrupted from about 1500 BC until AD 392, when the annual festivities were abruptly outlawed by the Roman Emperor Theodosius, a die-hard Christian. Now that's a long time for a lot of people to keep quiet, and for so little detail to leak into the historical record. But everyone who crossed the sacred threshold understood the price of admission. The word mystery comes from the Greek muo, which literally means to shut one's eyes. Under penalty of death, all visitors were explicitly forbidden from revealing what they saw on the inside. Whatever happened in Eleusis stayed in Eleusis. Frustrating as it is for modern historians, that policy served the mysteries well. The wall of silence only fed the mystique and guaranteed fans in high places. In its heyday, the temple attracted the best and brightest Athens had to offer, including Plato. To keep his experience classified, the godfather of Western philosophy used vague, cryptic language to describe the blessed sight and vision he witnessed in a state of perfection, the climax of his initiation into the holiest of mysteries. Like all travelers, Plato was permanently transformed by whatever he observed in Eleusis, the latest in a long line of visionaries, men and women, with exclusive access to cosmic truths. Following their sip of an unusual elixir called the koukion, and a night of spectacles in the temple, each pilgrim earned the honorary title epoptes, which means something like the one who's seen it all. Beyond any doubt, they claimed, death was not the end of our human journey. We do in fact survive the physical body, and underneath this mortal clothing, we are all immortals in disguise, gods and goddesses destined to the stars for eternity. All that after just one night in Eleusis? From otherwise rational, sober people, it sounds like crazy talk. To make sense of Plato, we have to remember how the ancient Greeks ordinarily approached the afterlife. At the time, most people believed the soul went down to the bleak and nebulous regions of Hades. Whether it would live there forever or eventually fade away was not entirely clear, and it scarcely mattered. Death was nothing to look forward to. When Odysseus visits the land of the dead, his fallen comrade Achilles famously grumbles, "I would rather be a paid servant in a poor man's house and be above ground than king of kings among the dead." Unless you'd been initiated into the mysteries, of course, where seeing is believing. One inscription found on the site says, "Death is for mortals no longer an evil, but a blessing." Pindar, perhaps the greatest lyric poet of ancient Greece and a fellow initiate, wrote in the 5th century BC, "Blessed is he who has seen these things before he goes beneath the hollow earth, for he understands the end of mortal life and the beginning of a new life given of God." For Sophocles, one of the most renowned playwrights of the time, the world could be divided into those who had set foot in Eleusis and those who had not. Just like Plato and Pindar, he stresses the visual nature of the experience. Thrice blessed are those among men who, after beholding these rites, go down to Hades. Only for them is there life after death. All the rest will suffer an evil lot. Without divulging the big secret, much of the ancient testimony, what little remains, hails the sublime vision that proved to be a once-in-a-lifetime event for every pilgrim. Clearly, the Greeks had a profound religious system at their disposal, one that seems to match the grandeur and sophistication of their many accomplishments, the many gifts we happily inherited to build a civilization from the ground up. Eleusis was an enduring tradition, said to provide concrete answers to timeless doubts, and optimism in the face of oblivion. It's unavoidable. There was religion before Christianity, which contradicts the running assumption that Greek spirituality was rather uninformed and idiotic. If you were taught a cartoonish version of Greek mythology in high school, or even earlier, that's when the confusion may have begun. You were probably left wondering how the people who not only gave us the word skepticism, from the Greek skeptomai, meaning to look about carefully, but actually practice what they preached, could possibly believe in fairy tales. Zeus is in charge of lightning? Poseidon rules the seas? Everything evil came from Pandora's box? If the Greeks seemed too sensible for such things, it's because they were. Let's give credit where credit is due. Like some cultural Big Bang, all the greatest hits suddenly burst on the scene some 2,500 years ago. Where there was chaos, the ancient Greeks gave us meaning through history, civics, and ethics. Where there was superstition, they created the first scientific disciplines like physics, biology, mathematics. Their stadiums and theaters became our sports and entertainment industries. They codified law, medicine, and finance, and laid the groundwork for the technology that consumes our life. The word technology itself comes from the Greek techne, meaning skill, cunning, or handiwork. Social media has drawn us into a hyper-connected global conversation that is entirely predicated on individual expression and the free exchange of ideas, fundamental rights that were virtually unheard of before the academies of ancient Greece. Every time we open up Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, we are tapping into that awesome legacy celebrated in Raphael's iconic School of Athens. Plato and Aristotle, surrounded by their fellow Greek luminaries, thinking our world into existence. Are we to believe the wisdom assembled on those steps got so much right, only to come up short on the most important questions of all? Why are we here? What happens when we die? What's the point of it all? By and large, animal slaughter, endless libations, and formulaic prayers were the kinds of things that seemed to please the 12 gods on Mount Olympus and keep disaster at bay. And for many Greeks, that was religion, but it didn't answer the big questions. For the level of brilliance on display in the School of Athens, bloody sacrifices to imaginary gods on far-flung hilltops wouldn't quite do the job. That's where the mysteries of Eleusis came in. Just one of many so-called mystery religions that fascinated the Mediterranean mind in the old days. For those curious souls in need of a little more substance and a little less nonsense, ancient Greece had a full menu of spiritual alternatives that proved more satisfying than the traditional fare. At the core of the mystery religions was an immediate or mystical encounter with the divine, involving an approach to death and a return to life. Like the mystics that would infiltrate Christianity, Judaism, and Islam in the millennia to come, the Greeks knew the ancient secret of dying before dying. However this one-on-one meeting with God was engineered, it's what Aristotle meant by the initiates descending on Eleusis not to learn something, but to experience something. Those inquisitive, cynical Greeks were after bona fide evidence, proof of the hereafter. They would never blindly settle for empty promises of a future life among the heavens. They had to peek behind the curtain to see for themselves whether there was any truth to the matter. For them and for us, how could authentic religion be anything less? As one empire replaced another, the value of that experience was not lost on the Romans, who adopted the Greek temple in Eleusis as their own. Cicero, the great orator and statesman of the 1st century BC, recorded his take for posterity. For it appears to me that among the many exceptional and divine things your Athens has produced and contributed to human life, nothing is better than those mysteries. For by means of them we have been transformed from a rough and savage way of life to the state of humanity, and have been civilized. Just as they are called initiations, so in actual fact we have learned from them the fundamentals of life. and have grasped the basis not only for living with joy, but also for dying with a better hope. In the 2nd century AD, the Emperor Marcus Aurelius studied in Athens and was later initiated in Eleusis. He is reportedly the only lay person ever allowed inside the Anaktoron, the Holy of Holies, housed within the main temple, the Telesterion. He earned the privilege. The philosopher, as he was called, oversaw an extensive construction project to restore the site after it was nearly destroyed by the barbarian Kostovoks in AD 170. What the invaders sent up in flames, Marcus Aurelius methodically rebuilt to Roman standards, ensuring the mysteries would never again suffer another desecration. Dwarfed chunks of 42 columns that once supported the 52 by 52 square meter sanctuary can still be seen. Roughly 3,000 people would have crowded onto the steps lining its interior to witness the secrets they had prepared up to a year and a half to observe. Only on the second visit to Eleusis did a prospective initiate or mustes actually enter the sanctuary to become a full epoptes. To keep profane eyes off the sacred affair, the philosopher also built a monumental gateway of Pentelic marble and a vast courtyard at the entrance to the site, now known as the Greater Propylaea. An imposing, larger-than-life bust of Marcus Aurelius has survived all this time, with a defaced image of a serpent-headed gorgon emblazoned on the philosopher's chest. The decapitated monster was a common way of warding off evil in those days, a stern warning to any future looters. This is sacred land. For a time it worked, until Christianity gathered enough steam to deliver the death blow. The gorgon would eventually be smashed in, replaced by a giant cross, carved with pleasure directly into Marcus Aurelius' heart. The soldiers of Christ had a message of their own. This is godless land, polluted by demons. It is the tiniest example of a disturbing period in history that is only now receiving honest, critical attention. Catherine Nixie's The Darkening Age, the Christian destruction of the classical world, sets the stage for our investigation. In a spasm of destruction never seen before, and one that appalled many non-Christians watching it, during the 4th and 5th centuries AD, the Christian church demolished, vandalized, and melted down a simply staggering quantity of art. Classical statues were knocked from their plinths, defaced, defiled, and torn limb from limb. Temples were razed to their foundations and mutilated. The violent assaults of this period were not the preserve of cranks and eccentrics. Attacks against the monuments of the mad, damnable, and insane pagans were encouraged and led by men at the very heart of the Catholic Church. The great St. Augustine himself declared to a congregation in Carthage that all superstition of pagans and heathens should be annihilated is what God wants, God commands, God proclaims. When the once hallowed walls of Eleusis were trampled in AD 395, the Visigoths may have placed the dynamite, but the church lit the fuse. Following Constantine's blessing earlier in the century, Emperor Theodosius had already made Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire in AD 380. 12 years later, he proclaimed the mysteries illegal, drawing a line in the sand. Civilization would eventually reap the secular benefits of all things Greek, but from then on, Christianity would serve as the default faith of the Western world. When it came to spiritual matters, best to pretend those Greek infidels and their satanic rituals never existed. For a secret religion like Eleusis that refused to keep written records, the extinction was swift and thorough. Before the end of the 4th century AD, total victory was declared by the early church father St. John Chrysostom. The tradition of our forefathers has been destroyed. The deep-rooted custom has been torn out. The tyranny of joy and the accursed festivals have been obliterated just like smoke. From the late 4th century AD until about 200 years ago, the history of Christianity and the history of the West are essentially one and the same. The crowning of Charlemagne by Pope Leo III as the Imperator Romanorum and Father of Europe in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day in 800, kicking off a long line of Holy Roman emperors that would last until 1806, the East-West Schism of 1054 between the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople and the Catholic Church in Rome, forever dividing Europe in half. The Crusades that preceded the Renaissance, when the rediscovery of the classics would lead to the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. In the Age of Discovery, from the 15th to the end of the 18th centuries, Christianity left Europe and the Near East behind, becoming the indomitable global brand it is today. Missionaries were dispatched to every corner of the planet to convert local indigenous groups in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Since there was no real separation between church and state, the memory of Jesus and the hope for his imminent return were the guiding force behind it all. Especially in America, the ultimate blank slate for Christians. The colonies were flooded with Protestant denominations of every stripe, seeking the spiritual freedom to worship their version of Jesus. Well into the 19th century, the doctrine of manifest destiny declared Anglo-Saxons a superior race, chosen by God to bring Christianity to the American continents and to the world. It's this legacy we see celebrated in Leonardo's Last Supper, the moment Jesus is said to have offered himself to his closest friends in the form of bread and wine, a foreshadowing of the crucifixion he would endure the following day, according to tradition, for the salvation of all mankind. This intimate dinner became Christianity's defining sacrament, the Eucharist. Do this in memory of me, the Gospels record. It is a moment reenacted to this day, multiple times per day, in churches on every continent for hundreds of millions of faithful. For believers and non-believers alike, Jesus and his early followers single-handedly changed the course of history. If only one image could tell the story of our humble origins, would it be the School of Athens or the Last Supper? Two of the most recognized paintings of all time, two very different pictures of our past. Once again, are we Greek or are we Christian? Where does the church end and where does the state begin? What better disconnect than the swearing in of an American president? In recent times, all the pomp and circumstance takes place on the western front of the United States Capitol building, an explicit homage to the Greco-Roman Pantheon in Rome. Its creator wanted to link the new republic to the classical world, and to its ideas of civic virtue and self-government. At the far end of the National Mall, past the Egyptian obelisk, Abraham Lincoln monitors the inauguration from his gleaming replica of the Parthenon that sits atop the Acropolis in Athens. Again, the architect felt a memorial to a man who defended democracy should be based on a structure found in the birthplace of democracy. Surrounded by neoclassical marble on all sides, the same pagan marble those Christian hordes tried to erase from memory over 1600 years ago, the presidents raise their right hands and swear the oath of office. On a Bible! For good measure, the last three presidents have actually used two Bibles. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One on a Roman Catholic missal. Naturally, none of this is mandated by the United States Constitution. It's just that old identity crisis rearing its head. It may all seem insignificant, but at the root of this Greek versus Christian debate are some really profound questions. Are we a people of reason or faith? Is our society founded on science or religion? Whether the issue is climate change, reproductive rights, or a global pandemic, that stark divide between the School of Athens and the Last Supper continues to frame the national conversation on matters of life and death. During protests over the unprecedented countrywide lockdown in April 2020, a green tractor trailer pulled up to the Pennsylvania state capitol, horn blaring, a defiant slogan freshly painted on the hood: "Jesus is my vaccine." Over 2,500 years into this experiment we call the West, is there any chance of reconciling the two competing worldviews that clash so dramatically at the end of the 4th century AD? If so, then, as with any good compromise, there will be plenty of disappointment on both sides. People of reason may have to concede that modern science has its limits. Not everything of value can be weighed and measured. People of faith may have to admit that we can no longer afford legend over history, or obedience over curiosity. In a rapidly accelerating world, big religion has failed to keep up with a younger generation that prefers fact over fiction. But big science and big technology may be going too fast, distracting us from the ancient search for meaning that defined the original religion of Western civilization. How do we bridge this gap? The whole point of this investigation is to test a crackpot theory that has been widely ridiculed and even censored by the academic establishment. When one ill-fated classicist by the name of Carl Ruck at Boston University took charge of the pagan continuity hypothesis with a psychedelic twist in the late 1970s, he started by claiming that the sacramental potion known as the kukion was a type of visionary brew, and that the inviolable secrecy surrounding the mysteries of Eleusis had everything to do with protecting the psychedelic recipe that guaranteed immortality to the Greek-speaking world. When this hypothesis first appeared in The Road to Eleusis 40 years ago, before I was even born, it was definitely the wrong idea at the wrong time. Exactly 2 decades had elapsed since Aldous Huxley's clarion call for the New Reformation in 1958, and during that time, psychedelics had gone from a respectable subject of intellectual pursuit among British gentlemen like Huxley to one of the most polarizing issues in America, not to mention the fact that they were completely illegal. Even the top universities in the country couldn't escape the long arm of the war on drugs. But that was only half the heresy. The Greeks had to invent the psychedelic Eucharist, and then the Christians had to give it shelter. So to answer the second of the 2 questions baked into Huxley's revolutionary prediction about the revival of religion, the same classicist at Boston University would later claim that some version of the Hellenistic sacrament had indeed been incorporated into the fledgling faith by Greek-speaking pockets of Paleo-Christians all over the Roman Empire, and that their original Eucharist was therefore intensely psychedelic. Like Erasmus and Martin Luther's obsession over the Greek of the New Testament, this controversial analysis of the actual sacrament that sustained the earliest Christian communities was ultimately an attempt to rediscover the true origins of the world's biggest religion, and the real vision of the most famous human being who ever lived. As the Encyclopedia Britannica makes clear, recovering the classics was to humanism tantamount to recovering reality. And the modern-day attempt leads to a conclusion no less groundbreaking than the firestorm unleashed by Luther during the Reformation of the 16th century. When we look at the Last Supper, maybe we're not looking at Christianity's founding event. Maybe we're getting a glimpse of the mysterious religion that was practiced by Plato, Pindar, Sophocles, and the rest of the Athenian gang. And just maybe, this is how our identity crisis comes to a dramatic end, with a psychedelic plot twist. Rather than starting a new religion, was Jesus simply trying to preserve or copy the holiest of mysteries from ancient Greece? Or more precisely, is that what his Greek-speaking followers wanted to believe? If so, that opens up a can of worms, making Jesus more of a Greek philosopher-magician than a Jewish Messiah. It means that the Jesus behind Leonardo's table really belongs on the steps of the School of Athens with his fellow initiates, because the earliest and most authentic communities of Paleo-Christians would have looked to the miracle worker from Nazareth as someone who knew the secret that Eleusis tried so desperately to conceal for millennia. A secret that could easily win new converts to the faith, but a secret the church would later try to suppress, according to the theory. And a secret that would render all the infrastructure of today's Christianity virtually obsolete, uprooting 2.42 billion adherents worldwide. Back in the Garden of Eden, maybe the forbidden fruit was forbidden for a reason. Who needs the fancy building, the priest, and all the rest of it, even the Bible, if all you really need is the fruit?